May 8, 1945. The American flag hung from the balcony of a requisitioned building in a small Bavarian town, whose name Sergeant James Mitchell would remember for the rest of his life. Mindelburg, population 4,216 before the conflict, though no one had counted accurately in the 3 years since. The war in Europe had ended exactly 3 days ago, and the spring air carried the scent of lilacs mixed with the lingering smoke of distant fires that still burned in the industrial zones to the north. Mitchell, a 26-year-old supply sergeant from the 761st Tank Battalion, stood outside what had once been an elegant restaurant, watching German civilians move through the rubble-strewn streets with their eyes fixed on the ground. He believed, as many did in those first days of peace, that victory would bring clarity, that the lines between right and wrong, between the liberated and the defeated, would remain as clear as they had been during the conflict itself. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What Mitchell was about to experience in the next few hours would shatter every assumption he had carried across the Atlantic and force him to confront a truth more complicated than any battlefield equation. That sometimes the enemy treats you with more dignity than your own brothers in arms, and that liberation abroad does not necessarily translate to freedom at home. The 761st Tank Battalion had been among the segregated units that proved their worth, despite being relegated to support roles throughout the European campaign. Mitchell had joined in October of 1943, trained at Fort Knox under officers who made it clear that black soldiers were expected to maintain equipment, not lead charges. The training had been rigorous but ultimately limiting. They learned to service the Sherman tanks, to manage supply lines, to keep the war machine running. But they were never given the opportunity to operate the tanks themselves in direct engagement. He had accepted this reality with the pragmatism of a man who understood that fighting for your country did not guarantee your country would fight for you. Mitchell had grown up in Detroit, the son of a factory worker who had moved north during the Great Migration, seeking opportunities that the South systematically denied. His father, Thomas Mitchell, had instilled in him a complicated patriotism, love for American ideals, coupled with clear-eyed recognition of American failures. When James had enlisted, his father had said only, "Do your duty, son, do it well, but don't expect gratitude. We've been doing our duty for generations, and we're still waiting for the thank you." Those words had echoed through every moment of Mitchell's service, from the segregated training facilities where black soldiers lived in inferior barracks, to the Atlantic crossing on a Liberty ship where they were housed separately from white personnel, to their arrival in England, where they discovered that some American officers worked actively to impose Jim Crow policies on British establishments that had no such traditions. The British had often seemed confused by American racial dynamics, treating black soldiers as they would any other Allied personnel, which sometimes created friction with white American command. Still, there had been moments, the liberation of villages in France, the grateful tears of displaced persons at the camps, the sheer weight of defeating such overwhelming evil, that had made him believe this war might change things back home. How could America demand blood and service from black soldiers, then deny them basic rights upon return? How could a nation that had just defeated an ideology built on racial hatred maintain its own system of racial oppression? The contradiction seemed too blatant to sustain. His closest friend in the unit was Corporal David Washington, a former schoolteacher from Philadelphia, who could recite poetry from memory and had an unsettling habit of seeing through comfortable lies. Washington had been educated at Lincoln University, where he had studied literature and history with professors who did not shy away from America's contradictions. He carried a worn copy of Frederick Douglass's writings in his pack, alongside regulation gear, and would read passages aloud during quiet moments. Washington had warned him, even as they celebrated in the streets of Munich just days before, that victory would not transform America overnight. "You think this is about defeating Germany," Washington had said, gesturing at the celebrating soldiers around them. "Brother, this is about preserving the American way of life, and the American way of life includes keeping people like us in our place. They'll use us when they need us, but come peacetime, it's back to business as usual." Mitchell had dismissed it then as cynicism. now standing before the restaurant door with his stomach growling after a long day of inventory duty, cataloguing supplies that seemed inexhaustible compared to what the defeated forces had possessed. He was beginning to understand that Washington's pessimism might have been realism instead. The restaurant was called Gasthof zur Linde, named for the ancient linden tree that stood in the courtyard behind it, a tree that predated the building by perhaps 2 centuries, its massive trunk scarred by time and weather, but still producing sweet-scented yellow flowers each spring. Before the conflict, it had been the kind of establishment where prosperous merchants and minor officials would gather for Sunday dinners, where white tablecloths and proper silverware signaled respectability, where the Herr Adler's careful attention to quality had earned a reputation that extended beyond the town limits. The building itself dated from the 18th century, with thick stone walls and small windows that had been enlarged in the 19th century to let in more light. Now it served as an informal gathering place for American personnel, though no formal designation had been made by the military government. Mitchell had heard other soldiers mention it, white soldiers from the 3rd Infantry Division who spoke of decent food and cold beer, luxuries after months of field rations that had grown monotonous even when adequate. The place had reopened just 2 weeks after the surrender, one of the first civilian establishments granted permission by the occupation authority, after careful vetting of the proprietor's background to ensure no significant involvement with the party apparatus. Mitchell pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges newly oiled and moving smoothly despite their age, removing his helmet as he entered. The interior was dimmer than the bright May afternoon outside, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. When they did, he found himself looking at a scene of casual restoration, tables occupied by American officers and enlisted men, their uniforms carrying the insignia of multiple divisions, German staff moving between them with professional efficiency, the clink of glasses and low conversation creating an atmosphere almost normal in its ordinariness, as if the world had not just emerged from 6 years of catastrophic conflict. The conversation stopped when Mitchell stepped fully inside. It was not a dramatic silence, not the sudden hush of shocked discovery that would have been appropriate in a melodrama. Instead, it was the gradual fading of multiple conversations, like a radio being slowly turned down, each speaker becoming aware of the black sergeant's presence and trailing off mid-sentence. Mitchell had experienced this particular quality of silence before, in segregated train cars back home, in supposedly integrated canteens, where his presence somehow made white soldiers lose their appetite, in 1,000 small moments where his uniform meant less than his skin. He recognized it the way a sailor recognizes an approaching storm, by subtle signs that experience had taught him to read. A captain sitting near the door, his insignia marking him as part of the 3rd Infantry Division's headquarters staff, cleared his throat. He was young, perhaps 30, with the pink sunburned complexion of someone whose Irish ancestry had not prepared him for the European spring sunshine. His uniform was clean and pressed, suggesting a role that kept him away from field conditions, and his hands, which gripped the table edge as he spoke, were smooth rather than calloused. "This establishment is currently reserved," the officer said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering information rather than making a decision, though both men understood the evasion. Mitchell held his ground, though his grip tightened on the helmet under his arm. He had not survived 2 years in a war zone to be intimidated by a captain in a restaurant doorway, but he also understood the practical reality of military hierarchy and the informal power structures that mattered as much as official rank. "Reserved for whom, sir?" he asked, keeping his tone respectful but not submissive, pitching his voice to carry to the other diners, making this a public exchange rather than a private one. The captain did not meet his eyes directly, a detail Mitchell noted. Men who believed in what they were doing generally had no trouble with eye contact. "Reserved for personnel who have accommodations arranged here? You'll find suitable facilities elsewhere in town." Suitable facilities. The phrase hung in the air between them, laden with meanings both men understood perfectly. In the segregated South, Mitchell had heard this same language used to deny black Americans access to restaurants, hotels, theaters, parks, swimming pools, drinking fountains, and every other space where white Americans gathered. The irony of hearing it now in defeated Germany from an American officer was not lost on him. Mitchell had not crossed an ocean and spent 2 years in uniform to argue with a captain in a restaurant doorway, but he also had not done those things to accept that peace meant returning to the same indignities he had left behind. He was measuring his response, deciding whether this was a fight worth having, when a voice spoke from behind the bar in accented but clear English. "Excuse me, please." Mitchell turned to see a man in his 50s approaching, wearing a crisp white shirt and dark vest that marked him as the proprietor. His grey hair was carefully combed, and his face bore the lined weariness of someone who had survived more than one war. The Great War had taken men from this town too, and the economic devastation of the 20s and 30s had left its mark on those who had endured. This was Herr Friedrich Adler, though Mitchell would not learn his name until later, along with the story that lay behind those weary eyes. Herr Adler addressed the captain first, with the careful deference of a civilian in occupied territory, but Mitchell noticed something in his posture that contradicted the submissive words, a straightness to his spine, a steadiness in his gaze. "Captain, forgive the interruption. This establishment is open to all American personnel. We have received no instruction to refuse service to any soldier, regardless of his duties or background." The captain's jaw tightened, and Mitchell saw a flush creep up his neck. The public nature of the exchange put him in a difficult position, either back down or escalate to an official complaint against a civilian establishment, which would require documentation and justification. "I'm giving you that instruction now. This restaurant should maintain appropriate standards for the comfort of its clientele." Herr Adler's expression did not change, but something shifted in his posture, a stiffening of the spine, a slight lift of the chin that transformed deference into quiet defiance. "Appropriate standards, yes," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the attentive silence of the room. "The standard that all American soldiers are welcome in our establishment, as required by Occupation Regulations Section 7, Paragraph 3, which was read to all business owners when we were permitted to reopen. The regulation specifically forbids discrimination based on race, religion, or national origin among Allied personnel." Mitchell watched this exchange with growing amazement. He had been prepared for the American captain's prejudice. That was a familiar enemy, one he had been fighting in various forms since childhood. What he had not been prepared for was a German civilian, a man whose country had just been defeated in the most catastrophic conflict in human history, standing up to an American officer on behalf of a black sergeant. The reversal of expectations was so complete that he briefly wondered if he had misunderstood the situation entirely. The captain stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor with a harsh sound that made several diners flinch. "Are you refusing to follow an officer's direction?" Herr Adler met his gaze steadily, and in that moment, Mitchell saw something he recognized, the expression of a man who has already lost what matters most, and therefore has less to fear than those who still have something to lose. "I am following the regulations of the Occupation Authority, sir. All military personnel are to be served without discrimination. This was made very clear to all business owners when we were permitted to reopen. The lieutenant from the military government office was quite specific on this point, and I have the documentation if you wish to review it." The captain's face flushed red, and his hand moved toward his sidearm before stopping, as if he remembered where he was and what he was doing. Before he could formulate a response, a major from the corner table spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of superior rank and perhaps longer experience. "Captain Brennan, the man's right. We don't have authority to enforce that kind of restriction here. That's written policy from division level and above. I've seen the documentation myself." Captain Brennan's mouth opened and closed twice. Then he grabbed his cap from the table with enough force to knock over his water glass, sending liquid spreading across the white tablecloth. "Enjoy your dinner," he said to Mitchell, the words coated in sarcasm and something uglier underneath, before striding toward the door. 2 other enlisted men who had been sitting with him exchanged glances and then followed, leaving a wake of uncomfortable glances from those who remained. Herr Adler turned to Mitchell and gestured toward an empty table near the window, which overlooked the courtyard where the ancient linden tree stood, its branches moving gently in the spring breeze. "Please, Sergeant, you are welcome. My daughter will bring you a menu momentarily." Mitchell moved toward the table in a kind of daze, his mind struggling to process what had just occurred. The table he had been offered was actually one of the better positions in the restaurant, with natural light and a pleasant view, rather than being relegated to a corner or near the kitchen doors. As he sat down, he became aware that the other diners had returned to their conversations, though a few cast curious glances in his direction. The incident had created a ripple but not a wave. For most of the men present, the conflict was over, and they had more pressing concerns than racial politics. The young woman who approached his table could not have been more than 20, with dark blonde hair pulled back in a simple style, and the same wary expression he had seen on so many German faces since the surrender, a mix of fear, uncertainty, and careful neutrality. She wore a simple dress that had been mended at the elbows, evidence of years of material scarcity, but it was clean and pressed. This was Anna Adler, Friedrich's daughter, and like her father, she carried herself with a dignity that circumstances had not erased. "Good evening," she said in careful English, with an accent that suggested formal schooling rather than casual learning. "I am Anna. May I bring you something to drink while you look at the menu?" Mitchell asked for water, and she returned quickly with a glass and a simple menu card listing the limited options available in those early post-war days. The menu was handwritten in both German and English, the English translations a bit awkward but comprehensible. The offerings were modest: potato soup with leeks, dark bread with preserves or cheese, a roasted chicken dish that was noted as limited availability, and bratwurst with cabbage. The prices were listed in both occupation currency and American cigarettes, the latter having become an unofficial currency in the chaos of the occupation. He ordered the soup and bread, not wanting to seem greedy or to deplete what he suspected were very limited supplies, though his rations had been sparse that day due to a supply convoy delay. Mitchell had seen enough of civilian conditions in Germany to know that food remained scarce, and he felt uncomfortable taking more than necessary, even from a former enemy population. While he waited, Mitchell observed the room more carefully, using the trained observation skills that his role as supply sergeant had honed. Most of the American soldiers present were enlisted men, along with a handful of junior officers, lieutenants and captains from various divisions. They ate and talked with the casual ease of men who had survived and were simply enjoying being alive. But he noticed that several avoided looking in his direction, as if his presence had created an uncomfortable question they preferred not to engage with. The German staff moved efficiently between tables, their professionalism a thin veneer over what must have been a more complicated mix of emotions. What must it be like, Mitchell wondered, to serve the army that had defeated yours, in your own town, in your own business? To serve food to men who had possibly been shooting at your brothers or sons just weeks earlier? To maintain politeness and service standards when your country lay in ruins around you? When Anna returned with his soup, Mitchell thanked her. She paused, seeming uncertain, then spoke again, glancing toward where her father stood near the bar. "You are the first," she said quietly. Mitchell looked up at her, noting the careful way she chose her words. "The first what?" "The first of your... the first black American soldier to come here, to the restaurant." There was no judgment in her voice, only observation, and perhaps a hint of something else, curiosity, or maybe recognition that this moment had significance beyond the simple act of serving soup. Mitchell nodded slowly. Probably the first to try, anyway. Anna glanced toward where her father stood near the bar, now engaged in conversation with an American supply officer about procurement of ingredients. "My father insisted you should stay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "when the captain gave the order. He said it was important. He said many things were wrong in our country, terrible things, and we cannot make new wrongs in the peace. He said if we do not stand against these things when we can, then we learn nothing from what has happened." Before Mitchell could respond to this startling statement, she returned to the kitchen, leaving him alone with his soup and his thoughts, trying to reconcile this unexpected moral stance from a former enemy with everything he thought he understood about the world. The soup was surprisingly good. Potato and leek, seasoned with herbs that must have come from someone's carefully tended garden, served with thick slices of dark bread that must have represented a significant portion of the establishment's flour ration. The bread was dense and filling, made with whole grains rather than refined flour, but it was fresh and better than anything Mitchell had tasted in months of military rations. He ate slowly, savoring each bite not just for its taste, but for the surreal nature of the entire experience. He had been prepared for rejection from his own army. He had not been prepared for acceptance from the defeated enemy. As he ate, Corporal Washington's words from their earlier conversation came back to him. They had been discussing their plans for when they returned home, what the post-war world might look like, whether the sacrifice and service would translate into social change. Washington had been darkly pessimistic. "You think because we wore the uniform, because we served, things will be different," Washington had said, shaking his head. "Brother, you're going to come home to the same segregated buses, the same colored drinking fountains, the same crosses burning on lawns. This war wasn't about changing America. It was about keeping America the way it is, preserving a system that benefits some at the expense of others. We're tools to be used when convenient and discarded when not." Mitchell had argued against this view, insisting that sacrifice had to mean something, that the men who had died in places like Normandy and the Ardennes and the Siegfried Line could not have died for nothing, that America would have to acknowledge the contribution of black soldiers and extend full citizenship rights in return. Now, sitting in this German restaurant, having been defended by a former enemy while being rejected by his own countrymen, he was beginning to see the uncomfortable truth in Washington's cynicism. Herr Adler approached his table as he was finishing the bread, carrying 2 glasses of beer, a pale Pilsner that caught the light from the window. The beer itself was evidence of returning normalcy. The breweries had been among the first civilian industries allowed to restart, partly because beer was safer than questionable water supplies. "May I join you, Sergeant?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that suggested this was not mere politeness, but a genuine request. Mitchell gestured to the empty chair. Herr Adler sat down and placed 1 glass in front of Mitchell, keeping the other for himself. "I do not wish to intrude on your meal, but I wanted to speak with you, if you permit, to explain perhaps why I did what I did." Mitchell took a sip of the beer. It was cool and crisp, better than anything he had tasted in months, with a clean finish that spoke to brewing skill maintained despite wartime shortages. "You didn't have to do what you did," Mitchell said carefully. "Standing up to that captain, I mean. Could have caused you trouble with the occupation authority." Herr Adler shook his head slowly, and Mitchell saw something ancient in his eyes, a grief that had settled into his bones. "More trouble than we have already experienced?" "I think not. My country has been destroyed, Sergeant. Physically, yes, but also morally, spiritually. We unleashed something terrible on the world, and now we live in the ruins of that choice. Besides, it was not courage what I did. It was necessity, moral necessity." He paused, choosing his words carefully, as if each one had weight. "You know what my country did. The world knows now. The camps, the hatred, the laws that said some people were less than human because of how they were born. We cannot pretend we did not know, or that we were all forced. Some of us knew, some of us did nothing. That is also a kind of guilt, the guilt of silence, of looking away, of telling ourselves it was not our concern." Mitchell studied the older man's face, seeing genuine pain there, and something else, a determination to make different choices going forward. "Why tell me this?" Herr Adler met his gaze directly, and his voice was steady despite the emotion behind it. "Because when that captain told me to refuse you service, I heard an echo, a familiar echo, the same reasoning that destroyed my country, just with different words, the same idea that some people deserve less because of how they were born. And I thought, here now in this moment I can do something. I can refuse to participate in that kind of thinking, even in small ways, even when it would be easier or safer to comply." Mitchell felt something shift in his chest, a complicated mix of emotions he could not fully name. Gratitude, certainly, but also confusion, and a kind of angry sadness that this German civilian had to defend his right to basic dignity against his own countrymen. "You know that your country and mine aren't so different in some ways," he said quietly, leaning forward so his words would not carry to other tables. "I can't eat at most restaurants back home, can't vote in some states. can't live in certain neighborhoods. The uniform doesn't change that. In fact, in some places, wearing the uniform makes it worse because it reminds people that we have the audacity to think we deserve equality. Herr Adler nodded gravely, showing no surprise at this revelation. Yes, this is what makes it even more important to resist it wherever we encounter it. If we say the horror was unique to one place, one time, one people, we lie to ourselves. The hatred is everywhere, waiting. It takes different forms, uses different justifications, but the root is the same, the desire to elevate oneself by diminishing others, and the only thing that stops it is people deciding each time that they will not participate, that they will take the small risk, pay the small cost to stand against it. They sat in silence for a moment, two men on opposite sides of history, connected by an understanding neither had expected to find. The afternoon light shifted, casting longer shadows across the wooden floor, and somewhere in the building a clock chimed the hour. Anna approached with a plate of sliced apples and cheese, placing it on the table between them. The apples were wrinkled from winter storage but still crisp, and the cheese was a hard variety that had aged well despite limited refrigeration. "From my father's private store," she said, meeting Mitchell's eyes directly, "for after dinner. He saves it for special occasions." Mitchell thanked her, and she smiled. A genuine smile, not the forced politeness of a server to a customer, but something warmer and more personal. He realized that his acceptance here meant something to both father and daughter, though he could not yet fully understand what. As the evening progressed, other soldiers came and went, the restaurant gradually filling as word spread that the food was good and the prices reasonable. Most paid no attention to Mitchell beyond the usual nods of acknowledgement between servicemen. A few stared, and one lieutenant approached his table, asking if he was lost, suggesting with elaborate courtesy that he might be more comfortable at the enlisted mess. But no one else made an issue of his presence, and gradually Mitchell began to relax into the experience. The major who had spoken up earlier stopped by Mitchell's table before leaving, pulling out the chair that Herr Adler had vacated. "Good meal, Sergeant?" he asked. "Very good, sir, better than I expected." The major nodded, pulling a cigarette case from his pocket and offering one to Mitchell, who declined. "Herr Adler runs a good establishment. Shame about Brennan earlier. There's some who still can't accept that regulations apply to everyone. He's a problem, that one. This isn't the first time he's tried to impose his personal views on policy." He paused, lighting his own cigarette and exhaling slowly, before continuing with careful deliberacy. "But regulations do apply to everyone. That's important to remember, in case anyone gives you trouble. You have as much right to be here as any soldier, and the military government takes violations of non-discrimination policy seriously. I'm Major Patterson, by the way, 3rd Division Judge Advocate's Office. If you experience any further problems, you can file a complaint through proper channels." It was as close to an official endorsement as Mitchell was likely to get, and he appreciated it for what it was. A senior officer making clear that the regulations were not merely suggestions, but enforceable policy. They talked for a few more minutes about neutral topics: the quality of the food, the challenges of the occupation, the rumor that the Pacific conflict might end soon with some new weapon that could level entire cities. Patterson mentioned that he had grown up in Boston, had studied law at Harvard before the conflict, and planned to return to practice after discharge. "Things are changing," Patterson said as he stood to leave. "Slowly, too slowly, but changing. Men like you, serving with distinction, make it harder to maintain the old lies. Doesn't mean the fight is over, but it means you've got allies. Remember that." After he left, Mitchell sat quietly for a while longer, watching the restaurant slowly empty as evening deepened into night. He should have returned to his quarters hours ago, but something about the atmosphere, the unexpected sanctuary of the place, made him reluctant to return to the realities of segregated barracks and the casual prejudices of daily military life. Herr Adler approached again as the last customers filtered out, and Anna began clearing tables in preparation for closing. The older man carried a small package wrapped in brown paper and twine. "Bread and cheese for tomorrow," he said, placing it on the table. "You are welcome here any time, Sergeant Mitchell. Your money and your company are both valued." Mitchell took the package, feeling the weight of something more than food in his hands, a gesture that transcended transaction, that spoke to connection and mutual respect. "Why?" he asked again, because the question still gnawed at him. "Really, why does it matter so much to you?" Herr Adler considered the question seriously, pulling out the chair across from Mitchell and sitting down with a heaviness that spoke to exhaustion. Not just physical, but spiritual. "I had a shop before the conflict, a bookstore in Munich, on a street near the university. I sold it in 1938, when the restrictions began and when I could still get something approaching fair value. My wife was Jewish, you see, Rachel. Her family had lived in Bavaria for 8 generations, since the 18th century. They were fully German, fully integrated, respected members of the community. But that did not matter when the laws changed." He paused, his hands tightening on the table edge. "She and our son David died in 1943. I do not know exactly where or how, only that they were taken to one of the camps in the east, and they did not return. I received official notification of their deaths in 1944. No details, just a form letter stating that they had died of typhus. I did not believe it then. I do not believe it now." Mitchell's breath caught, his mind reeling at this revelation. The man who had defended him was himself a survivor of the very evil they had been fighting against. "I'm sorry, I didn't know. I couldn't have known." "How could you?" Herr Adler replied, his voice thick with suppressed emotion. "I do not speak of it often. The grief is too large for casual conversation. But you asked why it matters. It matters because I learned too late that silence is participation. When I said nothing about my neighbors being taken, when I accepted the laws that forbade marriage between different peoples, when I sold my shop and moved to this small town and told myself that keeping my head down would keep us safe, I participated in their destruction, not actively, not with hatred, but with cowardice, with the desire to protect myself rather than stand with those who had less power." He met Mitchell's eyes, and there was a fierce intensity in his gaze. "I cannot bring back my wife or my son. I cannot undo the years of silence when I should have spoken. But I can refuse to participate in that kind of thinking ever again, in any form, even small ones. When that captain demanded I refuse you service, he was asking me to participate in the same system of hatred that killed my family. How could I agree? How could I become the thing that destroyed everything I loved?" Mitchell sat in silence, unable to find words adequate to this moment. The simple act of eating dinner had revealed depths of history and pain that left him feeling both honored and humbled. Herr Adler had not defended him out of abstract principle, but out of hard-won understanding of where silence and compliance lead. "I don't know what to say," Mitchell finally managed. "There is nothing to say," Herr Adler replied gently. "You did not come here seeking my story. You came here seeking a meal. But I wanted you to understand that your presence here matters, not just to you, but to me. It gives me a chance to make a different choice, to stand for something rather than simply surviving." He extended his hand and Mitchell shook it, feeling the firmness of the grip, the weight of shared understanding passing between them. Walking back to his quarters that night, through streets still damaged by the conflict, but beginning to show signs of recovery, Mitchell's mind churned with conflicting thoughts. He had just shared a meal and conversation with a German civilian, a former enemy, who had treated him with more respect and dignity than many of his fellow American soldiers ever had. What did that mean? What did it say about the world they were building in the aftermath of such tremendous destruction? He found Washington reading by lamplight in their shared room, a converted office in a requisitioned administrative building. The room was small but adequate, with 2 cots, a table, and a single lamp. Washington looked up from his book, the Douglas writings he carried everywhere, and raised an eyebrow at Mitchell's late return. "Where have you been?" Washington asked, looking up from his book. "Missed dinner at the mess. Carter was asking about you." Mitchell sat down on his bunk and told the story from beginning to end. The captain's rejection, Herr Adler's intervention, the evening's conversation and revelations. Washington listened without interrupting, his expression growing more thoughtful as the tale progressed, occasionally nodding as if confirming suspicions he had long held. When Mitchell finished, Washington was quiet for a long moment, then carefully marked his place in his book and set it aside. "So let me understand this correctly," he finally said, his voice carrying a mix of irony and resignation. "A German man who just lost a war to us, whose country has been occupied and divided, stood up to an American captain to defend your right to eat in his restaurant. A German man did this. After everything we just fought against." Mitchell nodded, still processing the implications himself. "That's what happened. That's exactly what happened." Washington stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkened town, his silhouette backlit by the lamp. "You know what this means, don't you? Tell me what you think it means." Washington turned back to face him, and his expression was one of profound sadness mixed with vindication. "It means the enemy we defeated wasn't geography. It wasn't even really Germany or Japan. It was an idea. The idea that some people matter more than others, that some lives have less value, that might makes right and the strong can brutalize the weak without consequence. We defeated that idea in Germany, crushed it militarily, occupied its territory, hung its leaders. But that idea didn't die when we won. It came home with us. It's been home all along. It's built into our laws, our customs, our daily practices. We just fought a war against it abroad while nurturing it at home." He paused, then continued with growing intensity. "That German man could see it. He recognized it because he's lived with where it leads. He saw his family destroyed by it. So when your Captain Brennan tried to enforce the same kind of thinking, Herr Adler knew exactly what it was and chose to stand against it, even though it cost him nothing to comply and might have cost him something to resist. He made the choice he wishes he had made earlier, when it might have saved the people he loved." Mitchell felt the truth of those words settle into his bones like lead. "So what do we do? How do we fight something that's embedded in the very country we just risked our lives for?" Washington smiled, but there was no joy in it, only determination and the grim acceptance of a long struggle ahead. "We remember. We tell the story. We make sure that when people talk about this war, they understand what we learned, that the uniform didn't protect us from our own people, that the defeated enemy sometimes showed us more respect than our brothers in arms, that liberation abroad doesn't mean freedom at home. We document it, preserve it, share it. And we keep fighting using different weapons now. Law, education, organizing, protest. We fought one war. Now we fight another." They talked long into the night, two black soldiers in occupied Germany, discussing the war they had just finished and the war that waited for them at home. They talked about their plans for when they returned. Washington intended to use his benefits to go to graduate school, to teach and write and document the experiences of black soldiers. Mitchell was less certain about his path, but felt drawn to education as well, to the idea of ensuring that future generations understood these contradictions and complexities. In the weeks that followed, Mitchell returned to Gasthof zur Linde several times. Word spread slowly among the black soldiers in the area, whispered in the segregated corners of the occupation, and others began to visit as well. Some were turned away by American officers at the door, but Herr Adler always intervened, always citing the occupation regulations with quiet firmness, always standing his ground. The restaurant became something of an unofficial haven, a place where black servicemen could eat in peace, where the color of their skin mattered less than the color of their uniform, where they were treated with the simple dignity that should have been automatic, but was instead rare and precious. Not everyone approved of this development. Captain Brennan filed a formal complaint with the regional military government, arguing that Herr Adler was creating division by making black soldiers feel specially welcome, that he was undermining morale and unit cohesion by treating American personnel differently based on race. The complaint was investigated thoroughly, with an inspector visiting the restaurant multiple times and interviewing both staff and customers. The investigation concluded that Herr Adler was simply following occupation regulations as written, that he treated all American personnel with equal courtesy, and that any perception of special welcome for black soldiers was actually just the baseline of normal service from which they were typically excluded elsewhere. The complaint was dismissed with a stern reminder to Captain Brennan that discrimination by American personnel against other American personnel was forbidden under military regulations, and that such complaints might be better directed at officers who violated policy rather than civilians who followed it. The irony of using occupation law to enforce equality was not lost on anyone involved. Here in defeated Germany, military regulations demanded non-discrimination, while back home those same men would return to legally enforced segregation. The temporary nature of this equality made it both precious and bitter. Mitchell befriended Anna during these visits, and through her he learned more about life in the town during the conflict and after. She described the careful balance her father had maintained during those years, avoiding membership in the party, through a combination of moving to a small town, keeping a low profile, and citing his marriage to a Jewish woman as making him politically suspect and therefore unsuitable for party involvement. It had been a dangerous tightrope to walk, and he had not always succeeded in protecting those he loved. Anna herself had been 12 when her mother and brother were taken. She remembered the morning clearly, the knock on the door before dawn, the men in uniform, the hurried packing of a small bag. Her father had been away overnight, visiting suppliers in a nearby town, and by the time he returned it was too late. They had tried for months to find out where Rachel and David had been sent, but information was deliberately obscure, and inquiries too persistent could draw dangerous attention. "Do you hate us?" Mitchell asked her once, during a quiet afternoon when the restaurant was nearly empty. "Americans, I mean, for what we did to your country." Anna thought about this carefully, wiping down a table near where Mitchell sat, her movements methodical and precise. "I hated the bombs," she said slowly. "I hated the fear and the hunger and the destruction. I hated watching people die, watching buildings burn, watching everything familiar disappear. But no, I do not hate you, I do not hate Americans." She paused, wringing out her cleaning cloth, then continued. "You came because we started this terrible thing, because my country unleashed something monstrous on the world, and someone had to stop it. That does not mean I am happy about how it happened, about the suffering it caused, but I understand it. I understand that terrible things sometimes require terrible solutions." She sat down across from him, abandoning the pretense of work. "And honestly, some of the Americans have been kind. Others have been cruel. Some have been respectful. Others have treated us like vermin to be tolerated at best. Just like some Germans were kind during the conflict, and others were monsters. I think maybe that is the truth about people. We are all capable of both kindness and cruelty, and we choose which we will be in each moment." It was this conversation that Mitchell would remember most clearly in the years to come, because it captured something essential about what he had learned in those strange weeks after the surrender. The world was not divided into clear categories of good and evil, ally and enemy, liberator and defeated. Instead, it was filled with individuals making choices, moment by moment, about what kind of person they would be, about whether they would participate in systems of oppression or resist them in whatever small ways they could. One evening in late June, as the occupation was settling into something resembling routine, Mitchell learned that his unit was being redeployed. They would be moving to France first, then eventually home. The war in the Pacific continued, though increasingly widespread rumors suggested it might end soon through some new and terrible weapon. Mitchell felt a complex mix of emotions: eagerness to return home and resume civilian life, uncertainty about what waited there, and a strange sadness about leaving this place where he had found unexpected acceptance. He visited Gasthof zur Linde for what might be the last time, and Herr Adler, learning of his impending departure, insisted on preparing a special meal. It took considerable effort and use of carefully hoarded resources, but the older man was determined to mark the occasion properly. The meal included chicken roasted with apples and herbs from the courtyard garden, real vegetables traded from a farmer in the countryside who owed Herr Adler a favor, and even a small cake that must have required considerable creativity given the sugar rationing situation. "This is too much," Mitchell protested when he saw the spread. "You shouldn't use your supplies like this." Herr Adler waved away the objection with the kind of dismissive gesture that brooks no argument. "This is exactly what supplies are for, to mark important occasions, to honor friendships. What else would be more important than this, than acknowledging connection between people?" As they ate, Anna joined them at the table, along with Washington, who had become a regular visitor as well, and had struck up his own friendship with the Adlers, discussing books and philosophy with Friedrich, and practicing his German with Anna. They talked about what came next, Mitchell and Washington's eventual return to America, the long process of rebuilding Germany, the uncertainty of the future, the hope that the lessons learned might actually lead to lasting change. "What will you do when you go home?" Anna asked Mitchell, carefully cutting her portion of chicken into small pieces. "I'm not sure yet. Maybe use the benefits to go to college. Maybe try to become a teacher like Washington here. Share what we learned, what we saw. Try to make sure people understand the complexity of what happened here." "Will you tell them about us?" she asked, and there was vulnerability in the question. "About the restaurant, about my father, about what happened here?" Mitchell considered this carefully, aware that his answer mattered. "I'll tell them, but I'm not sure they'll believe it. It doesn't fit the story people want to hear, the story of American liberation and German defeat, of clear good guys and bad guys. The idea that a German civilian defended a black soldier against American racism, that the defeated enemy showed more decency than the victors. It complicates the narrative in ways that make people uncomfortable." Washington interjected, setting down his fork with deliberate care. "That's exactly why you have to tell it, because the stories that make us uncomfortable are usually the ones we need most. The easy stories just reinforce what we already believe. The hard stories force us to think, to reconsider, to grow." Herr Adler raised his glass, the gesture formal despite the informal setting. "A toast, then, to truth even when inconvenient, to kindness, even between enemies, to the possibility that we can learn from our mistakes if we choose to face them honestly rather than hiding behind comfortable myths." They clinked glasses, and in that moment, Mitchell felt something he had not felt since before the conflict. Hope. Not the naive hope of youth that thinks everything will work out perfectly, but the harder, more resilient hope that comes from seeing the worst of humanity and still believing in its capacity for better. Hope grounded not in fantasy, but in the evidence of individual choices, like Herr Adler's decision to stand up for him, like Anna's willingness to see Americans as individuals rather than just occupiers, like Washington's determination to document and share these complicated truths. Before Mitchell left that night, Herr Adler pulled him aside into the small office where he kept his accounts and records, a cramped space lined with ledgers and receipts. "I have something for you," he said, pressing a small leather-bound book into Mitchell's hands. It was my son's, poetry in English. He was studying to be a translator before everything changed. He loved languages, loved literature. He would have liked you, I think. You both have that quality of seeing clearly, of not accepting comfortable lies. Mitchell tried to refuse, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gesture, but Herr Adler insisted, his grip on Mitchell's arm gentle but firm. "Please, I want you to have it, so that you remember we are all more than the worst things our countries have done. We are individuals, capable of choosing differently, capable of connection across any divide if we have the courage to reach across it." Mitchell accepted the book, feeling the weight of history and hope in his hands. The leather was worn smooth by handling, and when he opened it he saw margin notes in German, a young man's thoughts about English poetry, about rhythm and meaning and translation. David Adler had been real, had lived and thought and dreamed, before being reduced to a statistic in the greatest crime of the century. "Thank you," Mitchell said, his voice thick. "I'll take care of it. I'll remember." The 761st Tank Battalion shipped out 2 weeks later, loaded onto trucks that would take them to the rail depot, then onto trains heading west through a landscape still scarred by conflict. Mitchell stood on the transport truck as they rolled through Mindelberg one last time, watching the Bavarian countryside roll past, thinking about all that had happened in those weeks after victory. He thought about Captain Brennan's casual prejudice, about Herr Adler's quiet courage, about Anna's careful hope, about the strange world where former enemies could share a meal, and a moment of understanding, while supposed allies enforced division. The memory of those weeks stayed with him through the months of waiting in France, through the voyage home after the Pacific conflict ended with atomic fire and a world-changing exhaustion, through the processing centers and the discharge paperwork, and the train ride south to Detroit where his family waited. When he returned to America in November of 1945, after the surrender of Japan had finally brought total peace, Mitchell discovered that Washington had been right about everything. The uniform did not protect him from segregation, from discrimination, from the thousand small and large indignities that black Americans faced daily. He rode in the back of buses in Alabama when the train route took him through the South. He drank from colored fountains in Georgia. He found himself barred from restaurants that gladly served German prisoners of war who were being repatriated through American ports, but not black American veterans. The irony was not lost on him, but neither was it surprising anymore. In a German restaurant he had been defended and welcomed. In American restaurants he was turned away. The contradiction was so stark, so fundamental, that it demanded acknowledgement rather than rationalization. He did tell the story, though, whenever he could. He told it to his students when he eventually became a teacher, using his benefits to attend Wayne State University, and then taking a position at a high school on Detroit's east side. He told it to his children when they asked about the conflict and what he had learned from it. He told it to journalists who interviewed him decades later, when America was finally reckoning with the gap between its ideals and its reality, when the civil rights movement had forced the contradictions into public consciousness. Some people accused him of exaggerating, of making Germans sound too noble and Americans too prejudiced. But Mitchell stuck to what he had experienced because he understood that both things were true, that America had fought for freedom abroad while denying it at home, that the defeated enemy could sometimes teach the victor about dignity, that the line between good and evil ran through every human heart, not between nations or races. Herr Friedrich Adler continued to run Gasthof zur Linde for another 20 years, gradually transforming it from a restaurant into a boarding house as the American military presence in the region decreased and civilian life normalized. He never remarried, never stopped mourning his lost family, but he built new connections in the town and with the American soldiers who continued to be stationed in Germany during the Cold War. The restaurant became known among black servicemen as a place of welcome, a reputation that persisted even as ownership eventually passed to Anna when Friedrich's health declined. When Herr Adler died in 1966, Mitchell received a letter from Anna, who had taken over management of the establishment. She wrote that her father had often spoken of Mitchell, that he had kept a photograph of the two of them together, taken by an army photographer in those early post-war days when everything seemed possible and the world was being remade. In the photograph they sat at a table in Gasthof zur Linde, glasses raised in a toast, captured in a moment of unlikely friendship across the chasm of war. "He always said you helped him as much as he helped you," Anna wrote in careful English that showed the improvement of years. That in choosing to return to the restaurant despite what happened that first night, you showed him that reconciliation was possible, that people could move past hatred and fear to find common ground. You gave him hope that his stand against the captain meant something, that small acts of resistance to injustice could matter. Thank you for that gift. Mitchell kept that letter for the rest of his life, along with the poetry book Herr Adler had given him. He would sometimes read from it at speaking engagements about his war experiences, using the words of a young German man who died in a senseless war to remind audiences that humanity transcends nationality, that compassion crosses battle lines, and that sometimes the most important victories are the smallest ones, a seat at a table, a shared meal, a moment of recognition that we are all, ultimately, just people trying to navigate impossible circumstances with whatever grace we can muster. The story of what happened in that German restaurant in May of 1945 became part of Mitchell's legacy, cited in civil rights discussions and referenced in historical accounts of the segregated military. But for Mitchell himself, the story remained simpler and more personal. It was about the moment when his understanding of the world shifted, when he realized that the struggle was not just against external enemies, but against the ideas that lived in every society, including his own. It was about learning that moral clarity comes not from which uniform you wear, but from the choices you make when confronted with injustice. In his final interview, given when he was 83 years old to a documentary filmmaker studying the experiences of black veterans, Mitchell was asked if he had forgiven America for how it had treated him after he served. He sat quietly for a moment, gathering his thoughts, his hands folded in his lap. "Forgiveness isn't the right word," he said slowly. his voice still strong despite his age. I understood that America was flawed, just like every country. What mattered was whether we tried to fix those flaws or pretended they didn't exist. I spent my life trying to fix them, in small ways, teaching students about real history, the uncomfortable parts that get left out of textbooks, marching in protests, voting, organizing, telling stories like this one, stories that complicate the simple narratives. The interviewer pressed, "But after everything, do you regret serving?" Mitchell shook his head firmly, and his eyes, still sharp despite his years, flashed with conviction. "Never. I served because it was right to stop what Germany was doing, what Japan was doing. The evil was real, massive, undeniable, and it had to be opposed with everything we had. But serving didn't mean I had to pretend America was perfect. You can love your country and still demand it do better. You can honor your service and still tell the truth about what you experienced. Those things aren't contradictory, they're necessary. The country I fought for was the country of its ideals, not always the country of its practices. And closing that gap, making the reality match the promise, that's work every generation has to do." He paused, then added with the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak hard truths. "And I learned something important in that German restaurant that I might not have learned otherwise. I learned that people everywhere are capable of choosing kindness over cruelty, justice over prejudice, courage over cowardice. That German man could have just followed the captain's orders. It would have been easier, safer, less complicated. But he didn't. He chose differently. And that choice mattered. It mattered to me then, and it still matters now because it proved that we always have a choice. We're never just victims of circumstance or prisoners of culture. We can always choose to be better than what's expected of us." The book of poetry that Herr Adler gave Mitchell sits now in the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, donated by Mitchell's family after his death in 2008. Next to it is a photograph of the two men sitting at a table in Gasthof zur Linde, glasses raised in a toast, captured in a moment of unlikely friendship across the chasm of war. The placard explains the story in brief, but no museum display can fully capture what that moment meant. The collision of expectations and reality, the education that comes from having your assumptions challenged, the slow, difficult work of building understanding across divides that seem unbridgeable. History remembers World War II in broad strokes, the great battles like Normandy and Stalingrad, the political leaders like Roosevelt and Churchill, the turning points like Midway and Kursk. But history is also made up of smaller moments like this one: a black sergeant entering a restaurant, a German proprietor refusing to discriminate, a conversation over beer and bread that revealed more about human nature and moral choice than any battlefield ever could. Mitchell's story is not unique. Countless black servicemen experienced similar discrimination from their own military while serving abroad, returning home to find that their sacrifice had purchased neither gratitude nor equality. What made his story different was not the discrimination itself, but his encounter with someone willing to stand against it, and his choice to tell that story for the rest of his life, refusing to let it be forgotten or dismissed. In doing so, he added a complicating thread to the neat narrative of American liberation and German defeat. He reminded people that morality is not determined by nationality, that courage can appear in unexpected places, and that sometimes the hardest truths to face are the ones about ourselves. The restaurant building still stands in Mindelberg, though it is no longer a restaurant. A historical marker was placed there in 2003, commemorating its role as a site where Black American soldiers found welcome in the immediate post-war period, when such welcome was far from guaranteed. The marker includes a quote from Mitchell, words he spoke in his final interview. "In a German restaurant, I learned that dignity is not granted by victory, but earned by choices. That lesson changed my life." And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.